You think you know what power and luxury looked like in feudal Japan. Majestic castles, elegant tea ceremonies, disciplined samurai warriors, living by honor codes. But what if I told you that behind those pristine sliding doors and perfectly manicured gardens, Japan's most powerful rulers were indulging in obsessions so twisted that European visitors, people who thought public executions were afternoon entertainment, fled the country in horror. Today we're diving into the hidden world of the shogunate, where absolute power didn't just corrupt, it created monsters who turned human desires into elaborate systems of control and degradation. This isn't the romanticized version you've seen in movies with graceful geishas and noble warriors. This is the documented reality of what happened when men with unlimited authority decided that other human beings existed solely for their pleasure. For over 700 years, Japan's military dictators perfected a culture of sexual exploitation so systematic that it makes modern scandals look like playground gossip. We're talking about rulers who collected women like trading cards, who invented torture techniques specifically designed to enhance their personal entertainment, and who created bureaucratic departments dedicated to managing their most depraved fantasies. The Tokugawa shogunate wants you to remember their architectural achievements, their economic innovations, their cultural contributions to world civilization. They don't want you to know about the pleasure quarters that operated like concentration camps, the selection processes that turned girls into inventory, or the underground chambers where screams were considered music. But here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't just random cruelty by a few sick individuals. This was institutionalized perversion with rules, regulations, and quality control standards that would make modern corporations jealous. Every abuse had paperwork. Every violation followed protocol. Every broken life was a calculated business decision. So buckle up, because over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through the darkest corners of Japanese history that your textbooks desperately want you to forget. And trust me, by the end of this series, you'll never look at a samurai movie the same way again. Let's start with the selection process that turned poverty into a pipeline for sexual slavery. Picture this scene from Edo period Japan, around 1650. A government official arrives in a farming village outside modern-day Tokyo. He's not collecting taxes or conscripting soldiers. He's shopping for girls, like he's browsing a market for the finest silk. This was the uku recruitment system, and it operated with the efficiency of a modern human resources department, except the product being processed was human dignity. The official carries a scroll with specific requirements, written in bureaucratic detail, that would make your skin crawl. Age range 13 to 16 years. Must be unmarried. Must show no signs of physical defects. Must demonstrate appropriate submissiveness during examination. Yes, there were actual examinations. Medical inspections that violated every concept of human decency, conducted in village squares while parents watched their daughters being assessed like livestock. Imagine being a farmer who's worked your entire life to feed your family, only to have a government official inform you that your teenage daughter has been selected for service in the shogun's palace. The word service was a euphemism that hid horrors we'll explore throughout this series. You had no choice. Refusing meant your entire family faced consequences that made death seem merciful. The selection criteria reveal the calculated nature of this system. Officials preferred girls from poor families because desperation made compliance easier. They avoided educated families because literacy created problems, questions, resistance. They specifically sought girls who had never traveled beyond their villages because ignorance about the outside world prevented escape attempts. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The shogun's agents kept detailed records of every selection. We have surviving documents that catalog girls like merchandise. Akiko from Musashi Province, age 14, suitable for general service. Yuki from Kai Province, age 15, recommended for special assignments. These weren't just names in a ledger. These were children being processed through a system designed to destroy their humanity. The journey from village to palace was the first stage of psychological destruction. Girls were transported in covered wagons, unable to see the route, unable to memorize landmarks that might help them find their way home. They were told this was for their protection, but the real purpose was disorientation. Lost people don't try to escape because they don't know which direction leads to freedom. During transport, the girls received their first lesson in their new reality. They were assigned numbers, not names. They were given identical clothing that erased their individual identities. They were forbidden from speaking about their families, their villages, their past lives. The message was clear from day one. Your old life is dead. You belong to the shogun now. The mortality rate during this initial phase tells its own horrifying story. Palace records show that roughly 30% of selected girls never made it to their final assignments. Some died from the shock of separation from their families. Others took their own lives rather than face whatever awaited them. The officials considered this acceptable attrition, natural selection that weeded out the weak before valuable training resources were invested. One surviving diary from a palace administrator, discovered in the 1920s, provides chilling insight into how these officials viewed their work. Today, we received 43 new specimens from the northern provinces. Initial quality appears adequate, though 7 showed signs of excessive emotional attachment to their previous circumstances. Standard conditioning protocols have been implemented. Expect normal reduction rates by the end of the first moon. He's describing teenage girls torn from their families, and he writes about them like they're manufacturing defects in a production line. The conditioning protocols he mentions were systematic techniques designed to break spirits and eliminate resistance. We'll explore these methods in detail as this series continues. But imagine psychological torture refined over centuries into a science. The administrative efficiency of this system was staggering. The shogun's household maintained detailed inventories of their human property. Age, origin, physical characteristics, special skills, current assignments, performance evaluations. They tracked these girls' lives with the same precision a modern corporation tracks inventory. When a girl died, became pregnant, or was transferred to a different department, the records were updated immediately. But the selection process was just the appetizer. The real horror began once these girls entered the palace complex, where they discovered that their worst nightmares had been too optimistic. The uku, the women's quarters of Edo Castle, wasn't just a residence. It was a carefully designed prison where the shogun's perversions were elevated to art forms. The architecture itself was a tool of control. Endless corridors that led nowhere, deliberately confusing layouts that prevented navigation, hidden passages that allowed guards to appear anywhere without warning. The girls lived in a maze designed to make escape impossible and surveillance constant. Every room was connected to listening posts where officials monitored conversations for signs of rebellion or escape planning. The hierarchy within the uku was another masterpiece of psychological manipulation. New arrivals occupied the lowest rung, with slightly more experienced girls above them, and long-term residents at the top. This created a system where victims policed each other. Senior girls, desperate to maintain their tiny privileges, would report on newer arrivals who showed signs of resistance. The daily routine was calculated to destroy individual identity while preparing girls for their ultimate purpose. They woke before dawn for purification rituals that had nothing to do with cleanliness and everything to do with submission. They spent hours in training sessions that taught them to anticipate desires they couldn't even comprehend. They ate measured portions of food that kept them weak enough to be manageable, but healthy enough to be useful, and this was just the beginning. The methods were so effective that victims would thank their captors, so sophisticated that broken minds would defend the system that destroyed them. The training programs inside the uku made modern brainwashing techniques look like amateur hour. We're talking about psychological reconditioning so thorough that girls would forget their own names and beg for the privilege of serving their captors. The shogun's officials had perfected a curriculum that would make cult leaders weep with envy. Each morning began with the ritual of erasure. The girls were required to recite their new identities, their purpose, their gratitude for being selected. But here's the twisted genius of it all. They weren't just reciting words. They were participating in their own psychological dismantling. The repetition wasn't about memorization. It was about rewiring their brains to accept their new reality as normal, even desirable. The education system was divided into specialized tracks based on what the shogun's household had planned for each girl. Some were trained as entertainers, learning to sing, dance, and play instruments, while their spirits were systematically crushed. Others were prepared for domestic service, which sounds innocent until you realize that domestic duties included whatever the shogun or his officials demanded, whenever they demanded it. But the most disturbing track was reserved for girls who showed intelligence or independence. These were the ones selected for special training that involved techniques I can't describe in detail without this video being banned from the platform. Let's just say the shogun's advisors had developed methods to break strong personalities that were so effective, European visitors who witnessed them fled Japan and never returned. The point system was pure psychological warfare. Girls earned points for compliance, lost points for resistance, and were constantly ranked against each other. The top performers received tiny privileges, like better food or slightly more comfortable sleeping arrangements. The bottom performers faced consequences that turned their lives into waking nightmares. But here's what makes this system truly diabolical. The privileges weren't actually rewards. They were tools of control. Girls who received better treatment became desperate to maintain their status, making them more compliant, more willing to inform on others, more invested in the system that enslaved them. The shogun's officials had turned basic human needs into weapons of psychological manipulation. The competition between girls was engineered to destroy any possibility of solidarity or rebellion. Instead of uniting against their oppressors, they turned on each other. The system created an environment where survival meant betraying the girl sleeping next to you, where getting ahead required stepping on someone who was already broken. One account from a Dutch merchant who visited Edo Castle in 1661 describes witnessing what he called the daily parade. Every afternoon, the shogun would review his collection like a general inspecting troops. The girls would stand in perfect lines, heads bowed, while he walked among them, selecting who would serve him that evening. The merchant wrote that the silence was so complete you could hear hearts breaking. The medical examinations were another layer of systematic dehumanization. Palace doctors, all male, conducted weekly inspections ostensibly to maintain health standards. In reality, these examinations were designed to reinforce the girls' status as property. Their bodies weren't their own. They existed for evaluation use, and disposal at the shogun's discretion. The pregnancy protocols reveal the true depths of this system's cruelty. Girls who became pregnant faced one of three fates, none of them good. If the child was acknowledged by the shogun, the girl might be elevated to a slightly higher status, though she'd never see freedom again. If the pregnancy was inconvenient, it would be terminated using methods that often killed the mother as well. If the child survived birth but wasn't wanted, both mother and baby would simply disappear from the records. The suicide prevention measures showed just how desperate these girls became. The palace was designed to eliminate any possibility of self-harm. Sharp objects were forbidden, windows were barred, even clothing was designed to prevent hanging. The girls were kept alive, not out of compassion, but because dead property has no value. The aging process in the uku was a horror story in itself. As girls grew older and lost their appeal, they weren't released or retired. They were transferred to increasingly degrading roles within the system. Former favorites became servants to newer arrivals. Those who had once been prized for their beauty found themselves cleaning floors and emptying chamber pots. The disposal system was as efficient as everything else in this nightmare palace. Girls who became too old, too sick, or too broken to be useful didn't just vanish. They were processed through a bureaucratic system that documented their removal while ensuring they could never tell their stories. Some were sold to pleasure houses in distant cities. Others were sent to remote monasteries, where silence was enforced by more than religious devotion. Many simply disappeared from the records entirely. The psychological damage was so complete that girls who somehow escaped rarely survived long in the outside world. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to their captive existence that freedom became its own form of torture. Many who managed to flee would return voluntarily within weeks, unable to cope with making decisions or caring for themselves. The record-keeping system extended beyond just tracking the girls themselves. Officials documented preferences, performance ratings, and detailed notes about which techniques were most effective for breaking resistance. These weren't just administrative records. They were instruction manuals for systematic abuse, passed down from one generation of officials to the next. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire system was how normal it all seemed to those who operated it. The officials weren't monsters hiding in shadows. They were respectable members of society who went home to their own families each night. They had wives and daughters of their own, yet somehow convinced themselves that what they did during the day was not just acceptable, but necessary for maintaining social order. The economic aspect reveals another layer of calculation. The uku wasn't just about the shogun's personal gratification. It was a tool of political control. Regional lords who wanted to curry favor would send their most beautiful daughters as gifts. Those who fell out of favor would have their daughters selected for the harshest assignments. The system turned human beings into currency in a political economy of fear and submission. The religious justification made the whole operation even more obscene. Buddhist and Shinto principles were twisted to support the system. The girls were told their suffering was karmic debt being paid. Their service was portrayed as spiritual purification. Their submission was presented as the path to enlightenment. The very religions that should have protected them were weaponized to justify their abuse. But the uku was just one part of a larger system of institutionalized perversion that extended throughout Japanese society. The pleasure quarters, the traveling brothels, the debt slavery systems that fed the shogun's appetite, all operated with the same bureaucratic efficiency and moral blindness. We're talking about an entire civilization that had normalized the systematic exploitation of women and children. The international cover-up was as sophisticated as the system itself. When European traders and missionaries began documenting what they witnessed, Japanese officials launched diplomatic campaigns to suppress their reports. Treaties were negotiated that included clauses prohibiting certain topics from being discussed. Trade agreements came with unwritten understandings about what could and couldn't be documented. And here's the most disturbing part. This system didn't end with the collapse of the shogunate. It evolved, adapted, and found new forms. The mentality that created the uku, the belief that some humans exist solely for the pleasure of others, didn't disappear when the last shogun abdicated. It went underground, into private clubs, secret societies, and criminal organizations that continue operating today. The transformation of Japan's pleasure districts into industrial-scale exploitation centers reveals how the shogun's personal obsessions became the blueprint for an entire economy built on human suffering. What started as private perversions in palace walls metastasized into a nationwide network of licensed abuse that operated with the precision of a modern corporation. The Yoshiwara district in Edo wasn't just a red light area. It was a carefully engineered prison disguised as entertainment, surrounded by moats and walls that made escape impossible. But here's what most people don't realize about this place. It wasn't designed for pleasure. It was designed for power, control, and the systematic destruction of human dignity on an industrial scale. The licensing system reveals the bureaucratic genius behind this horror. Every establishment required official permits, regular inspections, and detailed record-keeping that documented every transaction, every girl, every act of violence disguised as commerce. The government didn't just tolerate this system, they managed it like a public utility, complete with tax collection, quality standards, and performance metrics. Picture the daily operations inside these licensed torture chambers. Girls were displayed in wooden cages along the main thoroughfares, dressed in elaborate costumes that hid the chains binding them to their posts. Customers would browse these human showcases like they were selecting fruit at a market, pointing at their preferences, while the girls were required to smile and pose, despite knowing what awaited them. The debt slavery mechanism was mathematically perfect in its cruelty. Families desperate for money would sell their daughters with contracts that appeared to offer eventual freedom through debt repayment. But the accounting was rigged from day one. Room and board charges, clothing costs, medical expenses, training fees, all accumulated faster than any girl could possibly earn them off. The debt grew exponentially, ensuring permanent bondage disguised as temporary employment. One surviving ledger from a Yoshiwara establishment shows the twisted mathematics of human exploitation. A girl purchased for 50 gold coins would accumulate over 200 coins in expenses during her first year alone. Her earnings were calculated after house fees, taxes, and various penalties that could be imposed for any infraction. The system guaranteed that freedom through debt payment was mathematically impossible. The health inspections conducted by government officials weren't about medical care. They were about quality control for human merchandise. Girls showing signs of disease, pregnancy, or excessive psychological damage were removed from service, but not released. They were transferred to lower-tier establishments, where conditions were even worse, creating a hierarchy of hell with multiple levels of degradation. The age progression system was designed to extract maximum value from each victim throughout their entire life cycle. As they aged and lost their novelty, they were moved to establishments serving different market segments. Eventually, they became trainers for newer arrivals, forced to teach other children the techniques that had been used to break them. The shogun's personal involvement in these districts wasn't ceremonial. He maintained private residences within Yoshiwara, where he could indulge his most extreme fantasies without the constraints of palace protocol. These secret chambers were equipped with devices and implements that turned human suffering into elaborate performance art. The screams from these sessions were so notorious that neighboring establishments would schedule their own activities to mask the sounds. The psychological conditioning extended beyond individual victims to entire communities. Villages that regularly provided women to the pleasure districts developed cultures of acceptance around this trade. The normalization was so complete that families would celebrate when their daughters were selected for high-end establishments. The seasonal festivals held in these districts were perhaps the most obscene displays of institutionalized perversion. Government officials, wealthy merchants, and foreign visitors would attend elaborate celebrations where human degradation was the main entertainment. These weren't just parties, they were showcases designed to normalize and legitimize systematic abuse through cultural celebration. The transportation networks that fed this system operated with military precision. Agents scoured rural areas during harvest seasons when families were most desperate for money. They established quotas for different regions, maintained supply chains that ensured steady streams of fresh victims, and developed logistics systems that would make modern trafficking operations look amateurish. The international dimension reveals how this domestic horror became an export industry. Foreign sailors, diplomats, and merchants weren't just customers. They were partners in expanding the market. Some European traders established permanent residences in Japan, specifically to access services that were illegal in their home countries. The shogun's officials encouraged this international clientele because foreign currency commanded premium prices. The documentation system extended beyond simple record-keeping to include detailed behavioral studies. Officials maintained files on customer preferences, victim responses to different techniques, and effectiveness ratings for various psychological manipulation methods. This wasn't just administration. It was research and development for perfecting human exploitation. The medical experiments conducted in these facilities under the guise of healthcare reveal another layer of systematic cruelty. Palace physicians tested drugs, procedures, and techniques on victims who had no legal protection or recourse. The results were documented and shared among officials, creating a body of knowledge about human limits and breaking points that served the system's darker purposes. The religious ceremonies held in these districts were perhaps the most blasphemous aspect of the entire operation. Buddhist and Shinto rituals were perverted to create spiritual justifications for the abuse. Victims were told their suffering served religious purposes, that their degradation was a form of worship, that their pain purified both themselves and their abusers. The economic integration was so complete that legitimate businesses throughout Japan became dependent on this system. Textile merchants supplied the costumes, food vendors catered the establishments, construction workers maintained the facilities, and transportation companies moved the human cargo. An entire economy developed around systematic exploitation, making reform economically as well as politically impossible. The training academies that prepared girls for these districts operated with the efficiency of modern professional schools, except their curriculum focused on techniques for enduring and facilitating abuse. Students learned specialized skills based on market demand, with advanced courses for those destined for the most extreme establishments. Graduation ceremonies celebrated successful conditioning rather than academic achievement. The retirement system for aging victims was as calculating as every other aspect of this nightmare. Women who survived long enough to become unprofitable weren't released. They were transferred to support roles within the system. They became recruiters, trainers, and administrators, forced to perpetuate the same horrors they had endured. Their experience became a tool for breaking new victims more efficiently. The seasonal rotation programs moved girls between different districts to prevent them from forming attachments or escape plans. This constant displacement was psychological torture disguised as business strategy. Girls would be settled into routines, then suddenly transferred to new locations where they had to learn new rules, new customers, and new survival techniques. The customer loyalty programs reveal how thoroughly commercialized this human suffering had become. Regular patrons earned privileges like advance bookings, special accommodations, and access to newly arrived victims. The establishments competed for wealthy clientele by offering increasingly extreme services, creating market pressures that drove ever greater levels of brutality. The inheritance laws surrounding these businesses show how victims became literal property passed down through generations. When establishment owners died, their human inventory was distributed among heirs like any other asset. Girls who had served one master for years would suddenly find themselves belonging to his sons or business partners, starting the cycle of abuse over again with new tormentors. The insurance systems developed around this trade treated human beings as depreciable assets subject to market fluctuations. Policies covered losses from death, escape, and damage, with premiums calculated based on age, appearance, and behavioral compliance. The bureaucracy of human suffering had evolved into sophisticated financial instruments that spread risk across multiple investors. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how this systematic horror became so normalized that it infected every level of Japanese society. The mentality that created these industrial-scale exploitation centers didn't stay contained within their walls. It spread through the culture, shaping attitudes about power, submission, and human worth that would echo through Japanese society for centuries to come. The documentation of customer preferences reveals the depths of depravity that unlimited power and social acceptance can produce. Officials maintained detailed catalogs of specific requests, ranging from elaborate role-playing scenarios to acts of violence so extreme they required medical supervision. The variety and creativity of human cruelty, when given institutional support and cultural legitimacy, apparently knew no bounds. The customer classification system developed by the shogun's administrators reads like a manual for systematic dehumanization. They categorized patrons not just by wealth or social status, but by their specific psychological profiles and preferred methods of inflicting suffering. Type A customers sought elaborate humiliation rituals. Type B preferred physical dominance displays. Type C demanded complete psychological submission. Each category had its own specialized training protocols for the victims assigned to serve them. The pricing structures reveal the cold mathematical precision behind this human marketplace. Base rates were calculated by age, with premiums added for virginity, specific physical characteristics, and resistance levels. Girls who fought back commanded higher prices because breaking them provided additional entertainment value. The more innocent or defiant a victim appeared, the more valuable she became in this twisted economy. The rotation schedules were designed to prevent any human connection that might interfere with business operations. No girl was allowed to serve the same customer more than 3 consecutive times, ensuring that neither party could develop emotional attachments that might complicate transactions. This systematic prevention of human bonding was enforced through severe punishments for both victims and customers who violated these protocols. The surveillance network within these districts operated with technology that was advanced for its time. Hidden chambers connected to observation posts allowed officials to monitor every interaction, documenting techniques that proved most effective at maintaining control. These observations were compiled into training manuals, that were distributed to other facilities throughout Japan, standardizing methods of psychological manipulation across the entire system. The seasonal demand fluctuations created their own horrors. During festival periods and harvest celebrations, when wealthy customers had extra money to spend, the establishments would receive special shipments of fresh victims. These surge capacity operations required temporary facilities that were even more brutal than the permanent installations, designed for maximum throughput rather than long-term sustainability. The medical monitoring wasn't about healthcare. It was about asset preservation. Palace physicians developed specialized treatments designed to maintain victims' functionality while hiding evidence of abuse. Cosmetic techniques concealed bruising and scarring. Psychological medications suppressed resistance without reducing responsiveness. The intersection of medical knowledge and systematic cruelty produced innovations in human suffering that served as blueprints for future atrocities. The apprenticeship programs forced older victims to train newcomers in techniques of submission and compliance. This wasn't just practical education. It was psychological warfare that turned survivors into accomplices. Girls who had endured years of abuse were required to teach others how to endure the same treatment, creating a perpetual cycle where victims became tools of victimization. The quality assurance protocols included regular performance evaluations for both victims and establishment operators. Girls were rated on compliance, appearance maintenance, and customer satisfaction scores. Operators were assessed on profit margins, customer retention rates, and incident management. The entire system operated with the efficiency metrics of a modern corporation applied to the systematic destruction of human dignity. The transportation security measures prevented escape attempts through a combination of physical restraints and psychological manipulation. Girls being moved between facilities were told they were being promoted to better positions, creating false hope that made compliance more likely. The reality was often transferred to even worse conditions, but the deception prevented resistance during transport. The communication blackouts ensured that victims remained isolated from any outside contact that might offer hope or assistance. Letters from families were intercepted and destroyed. Messages between girls in different facilities were monitored and censored. This information control created psychological prisons that were often more effective than physical barriers at preventing escape attempts. The disposal protocols for victims who became too damaged to be profitable were handled with the same bureaucratic efficiency as every other aspect of the system. Official records would show transfers to distant facilities or medical retirements, but the reality was often far more sinister. The paperwork existed to maintain plausible deniability while ensuring that inconvenient witnesses to the system's operations could never testify about their experiences. The training evolution over time shows how the system continuously refined its methods based on experience and feedback. Techniques that proved particularly effective at breaking resistance were documented and disseminated throughout the network. Methods that caused too much visible damage were modified to maintain the appearance of consensual participation. The system learned from its mistakes and became more sophisticated with each generation. The cultural integration was so complete that these districts became tourist attractions for wealthy visitors from other regions of Japan. Guidebooks were published describing the various establishments and their specialties. Travel routes were established to facilitate access for customers from distant provinces. What had begun as the shogun's private perversions had evolved into a national industry that attracted visitors like any other cultural landmark. The religious justification ceremonies held monthly in these districts were elaborate performances designed to sanctify the systematic abuse. Victims were required to participate in rituals that portrayed their suffering as spiritual purification. These ceremonies served multiple purposes, providing psychological cover for both perpetrators and victims, while creating public spectacles that normalized the entire system through religious authority. The competitive dynamics between different districts drove continuous innovation in methods of exploitation. Establishments competed for wealthy clientele by developing new services and techniques. This market competition created pressure for ever more extreme offerings, as businesses sought to differentiate themselves in a crowded marketplace of human suffering. The generational transition planning ensured that the system would continue beyond the lives of its original architects. Young officials were trained in management techniques, customer service protocols, and victim conditioning methods. This institutional knowledge transfer guaranteed that the systematic exploitation would persist regardless of personnel changes in leadership positions. The international expansion efforts attempted to export these methods to other countries, where Japanese influence was growing. Advisors were sent to establish similar systems in territories under Japanese control. Training materials were translated into local languages. The shogun's officials saw their perfected system of human exploitation as a valuable export that could generate revenue and extend Japanese cultural influence simultaneously. The legacy of this systematic horror extended far beyond the immediate victims. Families were destroyed across multiple generations. Communities lost entire cohorts of young women. Regional cultures were disrupted by the constant drain of human resources into this machinery of exploitation. The social fabric of Japan itself was rewoven around the normalization of institutionalized abuse, creating attitudes and behaviors that would persist long after the system's official operations ended. The documentation preservation efforts show how the architects of this system took pride in their innovations and wanted to ensure their methods would be remembered and potentially replicated. Detailed manuals, training guides, and operational procedures were carefully maintained in official archives. These records weren't hidden away as shameful secrets. They were preserved as institutional knowledge that represented significant administrative achievements in the eyes of their creators. We started with a simple question about power and luxury in feudal Japan, but what we discovered was something far more disturbing. The shogun's obsessions weren't just personal perversions. They were the foundation of an entire civilization built on systematic human exploitation. For over 7 centuries, Japan's most powerful rulers didn't just abuse their authority, they industrialized it, creating bureaucratic machines that consumed human dignity with corporate efficiency. The selection processes that turned villages into hunting grounds. The training programs that rewired minds and destroyed identities. The pleasure districts that operated like concentration camps, disguised as entertainment venues. The documentation systems that cataloged human suffering with accounting precision. Every aspect revealed a society that had normalized the unthinkable and made it profitable. But here's the most chilling realization of all. This wasn't ancient history confined to dusty archives. The mentality that created these systems, the belief that some humans exist solely for the pleasure of others, didn't disappear when the last shogun fell. It evolved, adapted, went underground. The same attitudes that justified centuries of systematic abuse continue to shape power structures today. So the next time you see a sanitized portrayal of feudal Japan, remember what was hidden behind those elegant facades. Beauty built on bones, culture constructed from suffering, tradition that was really systematic torture with better marketing. Because those who forget history aren't just doomed to repeat it. They're doomed to never recognize it when it returns, wearing different clothes.